Thanks everyone for joining today's masterclass focused on environmental claims. My name is Garrett Spina, Ontario Director with Crawford's Global Technical Services Group, supporting complex and specialty claims across Ontario. Before we hand it over to Ben Delgado, our environmental practice leader, I want to quickly run through a few items. This masterclass has been REBO accredited. We will submit the names of attendees from today's session and send your certification in the coming weeks. Also, today's session is being recorded. We will post the full recording on our YouTube channel and send it directly to everyone who registered but was unable to attend the live session. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please refresh your browser first. If the issue continues, let us know in the chat and our team will assist you. We will make time for Q&A towards the end of the session. You can submit your questions at any point using the Q&A feature, and I will be monitoring them throughout. If we run out of time and do not get to your question, we will follow up afterward with responses and additional resources. Now I'll pass this along to Ben to go over environmental claims in Canada.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks to everyone for joining on and spending your lunch hour with us, hoping that this is an informative session. And as Garrett mentioned, whatever we can't cover today, there'll be ways for you to get some answers. So we're going to kick it off, environmental claims in Canada. A little bit about myself there. If you don't have my contact details, they're there for you, and we can certainly connect offline if there are any questions, anything that you feel that still needs to get covered off. Feel free to reach out anytime. I've been with Crawford for about 3 years now. It's been an exciting 3 years as we continue to grow the environmental practice nationally. So it's been exciting. Lots of great folks here, and I look forward to continuing working with all of you. If I have worked with you in the past, and if not, I look forward to working with you. So here's the agenda. We're just going to go through a couple things, different policies that may be triggered, involvement of regulators and issuance of orders, reporting to an environmental responding to an environmental or pollution loss, cost control, some claims examples, and as Garrett mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So different policies that may be triggered. So the environmental impairment liability policy. This will be policies that you're going to see where coverage could potentially be triggered. So you've got your automobile policy. We'll see in a couple case studies and examples later on in the presentation where the auto policy would kick in. Just to get a general understanding of it, if there is a spill and it's tied to the use and operation of an automobile, this is typically the policy that will be responding to the loss. You have your premises pollution liability policy. These are going to be your policies for your on-site and off-site coverage, depending on the operations of the insured. They may have a site pollution policy to avoid any potential migration off-site from any products that they may store at their facility. If their operations involves the use of chemicals, they would have a policy like this as well. You've got contractors' pollution liability policies. This will be a policy that will be taken out by an insured while conducting their business, their operations on a third-party site. And in the course of their operations, there is contamination, usually an oil spill, diesel spill from equipment being used, machinery, temporary heating, storage tanks that are on site. This is the policy that would kick in. Storage tank liability policy. This one, it may not be as common, but I just want to take a moment on this one here, because this policy is very specific to the intent of the policy is very specific. This policy will cover any above ground or underground storage tanks, however agreed to by insurers, underwriters, and the insured. The policy will only respond to pollution conditions that are associated to the tanks on the site. So if you're trying to transact on the property, and you've sold, and now you're completing a phase 1 environmental site assessment, and you determine that there's contamination at the property. This will lead to a phase 2 environmental site assessment. If the source of the contamination at that site is not associated to the tanks that are listed on the policy is most likely not going to respond to that loss. So that is important to note. E&O policy for environmental consultants, who may see those occasionally pop up as well. Property policy with pollution sublimits. Most property policies have a small sublimit for pollution. It's usually not enough, which is why, depending on the type of operations of the insured, it is always important to have a premises site pollution policy, because the property policy alone will not have enough limits to respond to a remediation at the site stemming from a fire or vandalism or any peril that will be covered under property. And then you have your transportation pollution liability. This is also a subsection of a policy under an environmental impairment liability policy that, again, would respond in the event that there is an absolute pollution exclusion under a fleet policy, auto policy. If the operations of the insured is the transportation of goods, this is a portion of a policy that could potentially be triggered as well. There's one that's not on there, which is the CGL policy. And I've purposely left that one off because, for the most part, under a CGL policy, pollution is almost always excluded. Now, when there is coverage, there are very strict timelines to the hour that need to be followed. They are associated to when the pollution condition is discovered, when it is reported, and if the condition does not meet those strict guidelines, then any endorsement for that pollution coverage under the CGL policy will not be triggered. It's not sufficient. So I can't stress enough for any brokers or producers on the line. I always say it's very important to have the conversation with the client to understand their operations, understand the needs, because for the most part, sudden and accidental under a CGL policy, even with an endorsement, is not sufficient. So I've left that off there just because it's usually not covered, but when it is very very strict. So those are a couple policies there that could potentially be triggered under an environmental or pollution loss. So involvement of regulators and the issuance of orders. Whenever there's a claim, the insured is always very proactive for the most part, because they understand that the involvement of a regulator or the issuance of orders can result in costs being increased. If there's nothing done about a spill, the regulators can sometimes step in themselves, undertake the cleanup, and that results in costs that maybe could have been avoided. So regulatory requirements are different for every province. You'll see a couple of different provinces and regulators on the screen there. The regulators define specific soil, groundwater, sediment, and guidelines, standards that the property needs to adhere to, whether it's a residential site, a commercial site. There are different tables that are applied to each site, and the regulators require that those table standards be met for the site conditions. Some regulatory regulations are more prescriptive than others. Examples would be BC and Ontario. And some regulators do provide sign-off while some do not. So this becomes a little bit tricky, and we'll see it a little bit later down the presentation, why it is very important to ensure that we have qualified persons from the onset of a claim, environmental consultants involved, to ensure that the work that is being done at the site is done correctly. It is done to the standards that the site requires, because if a regulator were to look into the site at a later point, we need to have everything properly documented. that the spill was remediated. It's supported by laboratory analysis and samples collected from the site. So it becomes tricky when they take a hands-off approach where they say your requirement is to have it cleaned to the site condition standards that apply to the site where the loss occurred. And that's the extent of their involvement. I much rather when they're involved and they sign off and say, okay, the work that has been done is approved. We agree. It's met the site condition standards. We can close our file. So that provides insurers, it provides the insureds more of a peace of mind because they understand that the regulator has signed off, the work has been done according to the standards that the site requires, and there's not the uncertainty that maybe later down the road there could be an issue. And regulators also vary state by state in the US. Not to spend too much time on this, but I have handled losses on the other side of the border, and it's very interesting to see how neighboring states will treat losses very differently. You have a state like Indiana that will fine you for a loss. They don't care how it happened. They don't care whose fault it is if you're the one transporting the goods. And the losses have been associated to transportation of goods, and they immediately slap a penalty or fine on the polluter, the insured carrying the goods, who has spilled the goods, and then you still need to remediate it. And then you have state of Michigan where they will not become involved at all. I've seen situations where a spill happens and the insured took every precaution to ensure that the site was cleaned up, brought in a company, scraped the ground, took the samples, made sure everything was good, and we did not hear a peep out of the Department of Environment. So state by state varies as well, similar to Canada. So that's always also something to keep in mind if a loss happens in the U.S. Time is of the essence, as it is here, but in some situations the regulators can be a little bit more involved, more stringent, and the costs could exceed depending on the state. Just some environmental jargon that I've thrown on there for all of you. You may see some of these. Some are common knowledge. Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, MOE. You'll hear that very often. Ministry of Environment. The Department of Natural Resources, DFO, is Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. You'll hear BH number 123. That's a borehole. Remediation action plan. ESA would be an environmental site assessment. So just some environmental jargon that I've thrown in there. Again, some of you may have heard these terms in the past, and some this may be new to you. So just food for thought there. So responding to an environmental or a pollution loss. Steps to responding to an environmental loss. For the most part, the insured, whoever is at the site, will usually notify the Spills Action Center. They may also need to notify Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, or the regulator in that area. The minute it happens, the regulator is notified. One of two things happens. They just ask to be kept apprised of the remediation and the work that's being done at the site, or they send a field inspector who will go out to the site. They will make recommendations. They won't necessarily issue orders. So there's a difference when the regulators become involved and they send a field inspector to provide recommendations on what needs to be done. That's just them providing a map. They're providing a roadmap on what needs to be done at the site. If that roadmap isn't followed, if they're not kept apprised, if there's nothing being done with the spill, that's when they will issue orders. Orders usually need to be complied to within a certain time frame. If the orders are not met within that time frame, then we start discussing fines and penalties, which are usually not covered under the policy. So it is very important that at the onset of a claim, If a regulator is involved and if they have made the necessary recommendations, leads me to point number 2. The retention of a qualified environmental consultant is absolutely necessary. You need to have somebody that is qualified, somebody that will liaise with the regulator and who will keep them apprised. At the end of the day, this qualified environmental consultant will provide a final remediation report that is typically sent to me as the adjuster, the insurer, the insured who retains them in draft form, just to make sure that the contents of it make sense. And that is then shared with the regulator, who will sign off and agree that the work that has been done meets the standards. So if the regulators are involved, communicating with them, this can be very overwhelming for the insured, especially if they've not been through this before. So it is very important that the next step, or the retention of a qualified environmental consultant, should be their next call. Communicating expectations. In an environmental loss, there are many different parties. You may have the party that caused the spill. You have the third party, which may be the regulator because it is Crown land. It could be a neighboring property. There could be a landlord if the insured is a tenant. So there are various parties involved, and ensuring that all of the expectations are being communicated is vital and important to avoid any stumbling blocks, right? We want to make sure that this goes over as smooth as possible, that the appropriate parties are notified, and that everyone that needs to be involved becomes involved as soon as possible. Completing a preliminary site inspection. It's important to understand and get a good lay of the land, understanding what the source is, and if it's isolated, where was this point of loss. Understanding the extent of the contamination will help set the tone for the handling of the file, and it will also allow us to determine if there's going to be other parties involved. I've seen losses that have happened in an open field, but the neighboring property has crops and it migrates off there. We need to be able to track that as quick as possible to ensure that this is not leaching or migrating off to another property. So having a really good understanding of the site at the initial inspection is very important. Verifying risk or sensitive receptors. Is there a body of water close by? Are there sewers? Where do these sewer lines, where do they run to? Are they running to a storm management pond? Are they going into a nearby creek, river? Is this going to have an effect on human health? Understanding all of these things at the beginning, again, is very important. Determining the applicable site guidelines or standards. As I mentioned earlier, depending on the site, there will be different standards. So if it is a commercial site, there will be an applicable table to that site. If it is a residential site, that will fall under a different table, and the site condition standards will need to be met depending on the type of site. So understanding that, again, at the very beginning with the assistance of a qualified environmental consultant is important, because if the standards that need to be met are not as stringent, then sometimes without knowing, they'll do more work than needs to be done. And that can be avoided if we know which site standards are going to be applied to the site. Completing a subsurface investigation, similar to the site inspection, understanding where the spill happened, where it traveled, where it could have impacted. Understanding that right at the onset is important. Delineating the zone of impact. We try to avoid chasing the contaminants. Again, this is why having an environmental consultant involved from the beginning is very important. There are some situations where the insured experiences a loss, experiences a spill, and their immediate reaction is to mitigate and get somebody to start excavating. In theory, it's not bad, but it's not the best approach, because a lot of the times, if you just get out there on an excavator and you just start digging, you're digging and you don't really know what you're digging to what limits you're digging. So this leads to an increase in costs, which again, we'll see later on in the presentation and why it's so important, because these costs can balloon so quickly. So really understanding where that point of loss was and the area around it will allow you to properly delineate and say, okay, this is the boundary line of where we think the contamination occurred. We don't believe it's gone anywhere past this, and it allows them to draw that perimeter under which they will collect samples, they'll drill holes, so there's still exploratory work that will need to take place, but at least they have a baseline that they can work with. So understanding that is very important. Developing a remedial action plan. Again, this will also be determined by the data that's been collected at the site. Depending on the type of site, the remedial action plan could be to monitor. It could be a lengthy monitoring, and when I say lengthy, it could be years, right? Depending on structural issues, if there are any pipelines, if there are other lines that would prevent a traditional dig and dump, which is when you just excavate the soils and get rid of it, this may be handled differently. There's also first party and third party. There may be permits required. So being able to develop this and think outside the box is what we bring to the table when handling a loss. Being able to have these conversations with the consultant where we can think outside the box, maybe explore a couple of different options is always an important conversation to have. Ensure that we are complying with the regulatory orders. Again, if there are any orders issued, following those is super important. And then documenting everything. You can never have enough documentation when it comes to any claim, but when the environmental world, it is very important that everything is documented so that we can always go back and take a look at it, especially when we're talking about limits, volumes, the exceedances of the site condition standards. Being able to document that helps later down the road with subrogation. It helps determine whether there was any pre-existing issues. That opens then the conversation to, well, what were the previous operations at this site? Is there possible to go after them? Is there any way to share these costs with someone else, another policy, neighboring unit? So all of these discussions are had, but again, the more we document, the easier that becomes. Adjusting an environmental loss. So this is where our expertise comes into play. Following, and I'll just walk you through a few steps. I mean, it's not as easy as 4 steps is what I think I'm seeing on the screen, but it's a start. So once a file is received, once a new claim is received for an initial loss, we make contact with the insured and begin investigating on a without prejudice basis. This is always made known to the insured because the policies, as I've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's not necessarily coverage under each one of these policies. So just making it known that the investigation piece is going to be done on a without prejudice basis is important. That this is not misunderstood by the insured, that the loss is covered. Review the policy and determine if other policies should be notified. This to me is very important. Whenever I'm getting a claim right at the onset, the first thing I'll do is I'll skim through the policy to understand, A, is there potential coverage for this loss? B, if there isn't, is there another policy under which this insured could potentially seek coverage? And C, preparing those discussions with the insured, with the insurer, with the broker. The goal is always to ensure that we are helping the insured, and if there's no coverage under the policy, trying to find coverage under another policy where they could potentially be. So that is very important. Understanding all of the involved parties in order to gather the correct statements, CCTV footage, agreements such as lease agreements, property management agreements, any documents that are pertinent to the investigation. In a lot of the commercial leases, there will be a requirement on the tenant to complete a phase 1 environmental site assessment prior to taking over the the leased unit, and then they are also required sometimes to complete another phase 1 environmental site assessment when exiting the property to ensure that their operations at the site have not contaminated the lands. So it is important to understand that, and that's why we request all of these documents. Working with the insured to collect reports from the fire department, other entities if applicable, is very important. Understanding what the relationships are, who are their clients so that may have been involved in this loss, understanding all of the parties to the loss is also very important. Let's see here. So this is it's a continuation from the other slide. Working with the assigned consultants to determine the extent of the impacts at the site. Again, I continue to speak about this because it is very important that the environmental consultant is retained at the onset. We will work with the environmental consultant. They are our eyes and ears most of the time on the ground. They provide us with all of their information that they're able to collect. And again, we work with them on the best avenue forward. If no consultant is involved, we would then recommend a consultant depending on the type of loss. This is something that I try and share as much as I can. Whenever there is a loss, we will see insureds that'll just pick up the phone and they'll Google the first, environmental consultant or remediation company, and unfortunately, they're not always the greatest. I have had several situations in the past where, again, the insured has taken it upon themselves, and it's not wrong to mitigate the loss. But in doing so, they've reached out to companies that have charged an excessive amount of money for the work that needs to be done. And in some situations, they've actually charged for work that they didn't even complete at the site. And this was only found out after the regulator became involved. So it is very important, and I cannot preach this enough. If the insured does not know who to call, this is where the adjuster comes in to be a resource, or the broker will also provide that information. So it is important that a consultant is retained, a qualified consultant is retained, and if the insured does not have this information, we are more than happy to share our network of experts that they can contact. Providing an update to all stakeholders on the status of the claim following the initial investigation. Everyone wants to know what's going on, especially when it is their first claim for an insured. They've never experienced this before. They're getting emails from a regulator or an environmental consultant or a neighbor. What's going on? What's the status? Or they're needing to pump out water from the site because it's now contaminated and it cannot be released into the nearby creek or river because it's considered contaminated. So it can be very overwhelming, and being able to, again, manage this, provide insurers with up to the minute updates is very important and very useful. Continue to support the insured throughout the process, answer any questions that they might have. Our goal is to reassure the insured that the appropriate steps are taking place and that everything is moving forward, and we're here to be a resource and support for them throughout the process. Cost control. So controlling costs in an environmental loss. We work closely with consultants to ensure that we are going over the proposed remedial action plans and discuss the costs as well as the approach. I mentioned this earlier. It is very important that the discussion, the dialogue is open between me as the adjuster and the environmental consultant, because we need to have a full understanding of what options are being proposed. As mentioned earlier, sometimes it is very easy to approach it with a dig and dump. Let's get an excavator out here. It's the side of the road. It's the middle of nowhere. Let's dig out all of the impacted soil. Let's haul it off. We are done. That is easy. That is great. Where it becomes a bit challenging is you now have contamination underneath a building foundation. What are we going to do? How are we going to address it? Is there hazard to human health? Do we need to complete indoor vapor investigation? Are there, is there a risk management plan that maybe needs to be put into place? How often do we need to sample the groundwater at the site? These are the questions that need to be had with the consultant so that we have a full understanding of the loss and therefore are able to reserve for it. And we are also able to anticipate what the overall costs will be. It is difficult. I will say that it's not, things can shift. You could have some of the options from a regulator may be to have 4 quarterly groundwater monitoring samples collected, and if the 4 of them come back with no increase, that's usually enough to say, okay, we know that it's not migrating off site. We can now explore what the options are. There have been situations where you get 3, you think you're in the clear, then that 4th one comes in and it's the contamination has increased. You've got to start again. So there are specific guidelines that need to be followed, which is why I say we try to do the best we can to anticipate the costs and reserve accordingly, but there are situations that take us out of that, take us off that path, and unfortunately costs increase. Exploring the remedial action plans, as I've mentioned, very important. Ultimately, this will have an impact on the cost for the project. So really understanding that, making the necessary recommendations on reserve and payments. We work closely with consultants to ensure that all of that information is there. When experiencing a loss, it is very important that, and this comes into play when it comes to cost control, new versus pre-existing. Having these conversations with the consultant and the consultant being aware of what is and what is not covered is very important, because again, they could propose work that would include contamination that is not necessarily associated to the claim, which would ultimately mean there's more dollars and cents to be paid by insurers or underwriters or the insured that they should not be paying. So working closely with them is important, and this is how we're able to control all of the costs in an environmental loss. So just on the screen there, you'll see typical cleanup costs. So a small to medium spill, average spill of fuel, oil, diesel, around 500 liters can range in cost between $3,000 to $350,000. You might be thinking, wow, that is a massive gap. It is. There are cleanup costs that are very small. They're isolated. You're able to just clean them. You react, and it's not as costly. That same amount of fuel that spills out could potentially make its way into a storm water management pond. It could make its way into a sewer, and those costs now begin to increase, right? So it's not so much the volume that is spilled, it's also the conditions, right? The vulnerable receptors, potential hazard to human health. These are things that need to be taken into consideration. Residential heating oil spills. These are incidents involving heating oil. These can be very costly because they most of the time will always affect the structure that's in place. So this is oil, fuel that migrates underneath the building foundation. And sometimes this leads to the structure actually needing to be taken down, rebuilt. It's the only way for them to get through to the contamination. So these can be costly, between $30,000 to $1.5 million. Again, very large range, because it all really depends on how far down the contaminants migrate, leach into, and whether they can be cleaned up via hydrovac, fully eliminated, or if there will be an ongoing monitoring, or if the structure needs to be torn down. So just some numbers there. More numbers, new versus pre-existing. This is also very important, as I mentioned to you. With new pollution conditions, the process or approach is fairly fairly similar to all. You do your emergency response, getting rid of the source, ensuring that the appropriate investigation is undertaken, excavation or use of vac truck to remove liquid waste, disposal of contaminated materials, confirmatory sampling, and final reporting. This is where the qualified environmental consultant will give their seal of approval and say the site is considered clean. Off we go. There are a couple of, there's a cost range there for minor surface spills to significant groundwater impact. Again, if you handled an environmental loss before, you know that these costs can climb fairly quickly, which is why, as I mentioned in my previous slide, we do our best to control these costs. There's a couple of costs there for you. Pre-existing pollution conditions are a different story. These require extensive delineation and determination of the plume. It's pre-existing conditions is usually the gift that keeps on giving, because when you think you've figured it out, you've figured out the plume, you've delineated the site, you start digging somewhere else, and then you say, oh, well, there's impacts here too. So now you need to look at the flow of groundwater. And this goes back to the earlier comment. What were the operations of the previous tenant? What are these are these contaminants that are migrating off site? This will lead to sampling, groundwatering, a monitoring plan that will go on for a long period of time. It will most likely always involve regulators, because at this point the contamination has been there for some time. It's potentially leached off onto crown lands. The regulator is now involved. Risk assessments will need to be assessed, and remediation targets become more strict. As you can see, the typical cost range for historical contamination types is significantly higher than a new pollution condition. So just some numbers for you all to take a look at there. Some notable incidents in Canada. Elliott Lake, 2024. There was an oil spill affecting 2 sanitary lift stations. Cleanup costs of approximately $181,000. This involved the storage of 75,000 liters of contaminated product in specialized tanks. The McLean Mill in BC in 2020, a 6,000 liter bunker oil spill from a rail tank car, which led to cleanup costs exceeding $1 million. So you'll notice there, 75,000 liters, 182,000, 6,000 liters, $1 million. It all really depends on the environment, on what's been affected, how easy or difficult it becomes to address the impacts. And North Saskatchewan river spill, major pipeline rupture of 225,000 liters of heavy oil. This had a cleanup cost ticket of $107 million, give or take. That's the approximate number. This affected drinking water supplies, required extensive remediation efforts. Again, we're talking about drinking water, which means that there is hazard to human health. The regulators become way more involved. There are stricter guidelines, which again leads to ongoing monitoring, possibly for many years after the remediation has been completed, which is why the costs also rise. So we're just going to go through a couple of claims examples. I think we've still got some time here. Spills while a tractor trailer is in motion. Again, very quick example of where we would see a loss like this. Your insured is hauling oil, gas, hazardous goods, environmental acid, whatever it may be. In the process of hauling these goods, there's a spill of the goods. Root cause of the spill would still need to be investigated. The spill results in the involvement of a local regulator, and the insured has been mandated to begin a cleanup of the spill. The insured will immediately retain environmental consultant or contractor to begin addressing the spill. Typically, a loss like this would fall under the automobile policy. There's a spill, whether the spill was due to the goods that were being carried, that were improperly improperly stored, whether this stems from a motor vehicle accident. This would always fall under the auto policy under use and operation. This is also where you could potentially see transportation pollution liability coverages being covered under another environmental impairment liability policy if that coverage exists, covered operations. So there are avenues under which an insured facing a situation like this could potentially seek coverage. Another example, pollution created by vandalism or fire. For a while, and I'm not sure if it's still ongoing, but there have been various fires that have been caused by vandalism. If your insured has a tractor trailer that has two tanks that hold, 10,000 gallons of fuel, or however many thousands gallons of fuel may be stored as transport on the truck. There's a fire, all of these items leach out, or the tractor could just be on its own and all of these automobile fluids leach out. You now have damage to a leased premises. So now you have the involvement of a landlord who wants to make sure that the site is properly cleaned up. Again, there may be pre-existing contamination at the site that is not necessarily associated to the loss. So it is very important that these conversations be had with the environmental consultant, because they need to differentiate and separate what's new and related to this fire, what's been there for a while. And that can sometimes be as easy as, well, the automobile fluids are all concentrated to one spot, and we have a hit of methanol or glycol or another contaminant somewhere else that is completely unrelated to anything that would have been in the automobile or the truck. So that is fairly easy to separate, but sometimes there is commingling, and that's why it's very important to ensure that the proper questions are asked with the consultant to avoid overpaying for a claim that shouldn't be paid. So that's a type of loss that you'll see where there could potentially be a pollution claim created. Fairly simple. We drive by these all the time. We'll see them on the QEW, on the DVP, on the 401, really any highway, any freeway. Trucks rolled over. There is a spill of fluids from the tractor or from goods that are being carried. There is damage to the guardrail, the median, overhead lines. These are all associated to property damage that, again, would fall under the auto policy. Pollution claims stemming from storage tank policies. As mentioned earlier, if you have a storage tank policy, the purpose of that policy is to cover any tanks that are listed on the policy. You could have a storage tank policy, but if you have a storage tank that was never listed, added after the fact, was not part of the insurance application, just because the storage tank policy is there, if that tank is not listed, the chances of the claim being denied are very high. So the goal with these policies, again, is to cover anything that could be released from the tank, whether it be any apparatus attached to the tank, a hose, a nozzle, the tank itself, that any pollution claims that stem from the tank would potentially fall under that policy. Again, this is where the investigation, understanding maintenance, understanding installation of the tank, potential failure, origin and cause, what caused this tank to fail, all of that is very important to know, because that opens doors for potential subrogation or liability transfer. Contractor pollution liability policies, again, just a couple of examples. Fluid leaks from equipment while being used at a construction site. Oil escapes from a temporary heating tank, which results in contamination at the site. Contamination of the site while conducting operations. And again, we'll see it because this is an ongoing trend, vandalism or theft of fuel from a temporary above ground storage tank, or from a temporary heating oil tank at the site. They're trying to steal it, spill happens. This is under the policy that it could potentially be triggered. Spills associated to the delivery of fuel and other goods. As the photograph clearly shows, the right way that the fuel delivery employee should be is next to the truck. If anything happens, they're right next to a stop valve that they can just hit. If not, again, falls potentially under the auto policy or transportation pollution liability under other policies if they have that coverage. And that is the type of claim that you would see. So as you can see in the image there, you've got that home. If there is a spill because the employee decided it was too cold and he wanted to wait inside, or he wanted to go and catch up on his social media, whatever he decides to do, rather than stand next to the stop valve and the spill happens, once that oil or fuel seep underneath that home there, it becomes very difficult to get it out. So that home might need to come down. Premises pollution liability policies, again, spills that begin at the insured site stemming from their business operations. On-site and off-site typically will be listed on the policy. Pollution conditions created, again, by vandalism or theft of fuel, oil, or other materials from the site. And pollution at the premises caused by a fire at the site. So that these are types of losses that you might see under a premises pollution liability policy. So with that, I think we've left enough time there for you, Garrett. So I'm not sure if there are any questions that anyone has that I can answer.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a really insightful session. So I'll open it up to the group for some questions. We do have one in here right now. What would you consider to be pre-existing conditions?
Yeah, so pre-existing conditions are, again, you could have a site where the insured is leased at the time. They didn't notice any issues. They then have to complete another environmental site assessment. In the process of completing that, they now find the contamination at the property. Pre-existing could be maybe it was missed during the first investigation. It could be not associated to any of the operations that the insured has at the site. For example, the insured operates a furniture store and they do not deliver, so they do not have a fleet of trucks. They do not have any tanks at the site, but now there is a contamination of fuel or oil discovered at the site. That could potentially be pre-existing as it predates them taking over the site, and it may not be attached to any of their operations. Again, it could be sometimes very easy to determine, and sometimes it could be a little bit more difficult. If there is contamination at a site when an insured takes it over, and there's fuel, there's oil spills, and as part of their operations, they deal with automobile fluids, fuel, oil. It can be very difficult to determine what's new versus what could have already been there. It is a lot easier when the contamination that's there is unrelated to any of the insured's operations. There's a pre-existing contamination of glycol, but the insured doesn't use glycol at the site. So that would be the difference between the two.
Okay, thank you. So while everyone's sort of thinking of their questions, I got a couple here for you. I guess from your experience, Ben, what would be the most critical first step in the first 24 hours of handling an environmental loss? I guess that would make the biggest difference overall in the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I said at the beginning, the most important piece there is ensuring that a qualified environmental consultant is involved right at the beginning. This is having them involved is a cost, but it will help avoid any overspending right at the beginning, because you're going to have an environmental consultant that will provide direction and that will ensure that they're managing the various parties, such as the regulator, the insured, a remediation contractor. If there's an immediate action that needs to take place, they are there and they're able to provide the direction. At the end of the day, they're the ones providing that roadmap. If the regulator hasn't already done so, they're providing that roadmap so that the insured and the remediation contractor know what they're doing and they are able to complete the task at hand without overworking. So that I would say is very vital. That will usually always has an impact on how the claim goes right at the onset.
Okay, thanks. There's another one here. Is there often a need to arrange for security depending on the level of pollution or type of contaminant involved?
Um, in terms of having like securing the site after a loss or to avoid a loss.
It doesn't specify. It's probably
Yeah.
during the incident or the
Yeah.
remediation aspect of it.
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, for the most part, after the spills occurred, after you've determined what the source is, um, as long as if it needs to be, you know, cornered off with fence or whatever the case may be, that'll be done by the remediation company. If there's going to be a massive hole in the ground while they're digging, they will put up the necessary fences and barricades around it to avoid anybody from stepping into it. I've never seen a situation where we need to have any security or staff on site. There are certain eh, depending on the operations of the insured and depending on the goods that they carry, sometimes it is very important or necessary to have some form of security or personnel at the site to avoid the theft. We see this a lot with unmanned card lock facilities where you just show up, you got a code, you punch in your information, and off you go with fueling up and picking up the product. We have seen situations where they don't have anyone on site. There may not be even a fence around it. That's just it's an easy access for somebody who wants to steal fuel. So in a case like that, it's a business decision. They should have somebody. But I've never seen a situation where they haven't had it and a claim's been denied because they didn't have it. There's not necessarily a requirement for them to do that. So hopefully that answers either of the questions, whether it's post-loss or pre-loss.
Excellent. Thank you. In terms of consultants, do you have any qualified environmental consultants that you would recommend to work with?
Yeah. So part of our services that we provide in our practice is a network of environmental consultants that are for the most part on all insurers vendor lists, and they're approved. If there's a conflict, we have more than one that we can always go to. So what I always preach to the brokers, the insureds, when they've had a loss and they haven't necessarily retained the best consultant at the onset, is if you ever have any issues, find a way to get a hold of us or even through the broker, ensure that here's a network of consultants that you can reach out to. And I mean, I've had various losses where the insured says, I haven't called anybody, do you have recommendations? And we'll make the necessary recommendations, right? So yes, we do have a network that we work with.
Okay. Just one more question here for you, Ben. From an adjusting perspective, what are the most common mistakes that you see early in an environmental claim that we should be mindful of to avoid?
Um, I guess I can speak to it from the point of, again, the insured, right? So the insured reports a loss, and they're now looking for some guidance. Again, some of probably one of the biggest mistakes insured could make is reaching out to somebody that doesn't necessarily know what they're doing, right? Reaching out to a remediation contractor, an environmental consultant, seeking assistance from someone who's not qualified or does not know what they're doing. This ultimately ends up being very costly. Sometimes not understanding, and again, that's after the loss when insured. I mean, from a pre-loss standpoint, I would say not having a full understanding of what the operations of the insured is and really
Okay, thank you. So we're just about at time, so we'll wrap things up where we are. I just want to say thanks again to Ben for great discussions, and thanks for everyone who joined us today. Just a quick reminder, we'll be sending out the recording after the session, and it'll also be up on our Crawford YouTube channel. And if you want to watch it back or share it with your team, if you have interest in what's coming up, you can check out our upcoming masterclass sessions on the events page. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks everyone for joining.